believe it or not, that's only 15 verses. Several years ago, I was in Argentina, and one of our adventures was a day trip up into the high Andes from a city called Salta, and it was a long, exhausting, wonderful day, which included 16th century Jesuit missions, high Andes mountain native people and their crafts and foods, enormous salt lakes, and astonishing geography. The higher we got in elevation, the more susceptible we all were to nausea and altitude sickness. And it didn't help that we were bouncing along on wooden benches rigged up in a converted dump truck. It was an unforgettable journey, but I want to highlight our last stop. We were ferried up switchback style, forward and back along a high gravel road with no guardrails to the top of a promontory that overlooked the valley way down below on 3 sides. I remember thinking, well, this is as good a place to die as any. The promontory was a highly defensible position, and that would have been very difficult to take for an advancing army to take. This city was deserted now, but it had been a fully developed urban area with houses with adjoining walls that covered the entire plateau and not a bit of extra space. If you think of Machu Picchu, that place in Peru, same kind of thing with the walls that were connecting. Machu Picchu is greener, but it was the same kind of look. The theory is that the native population went down the hillside during the day, cultivated their crops, and climbed back up at night. But one of the interesting things about this place is nobody knows what happened to them, to the people who lived there. One theory is that one theory that's rejected is that they died of disease, but there are no cemeteries. There are no bones anywhere. Another theory is that they ran away, that they were artisans and so on, and but there's nothing left behind, that there's no artifacts. So the assumption is that they took their tools and so on with them. So the speculation is, and nobody knows for sure, is these are people who ran. They were expecting that the Spanish conquistadors who were coming up from Buenos Aires were coming at them, and they'd heard that the conquistadors were savaging everybody they came to. They were either destroying them or converting them. And so these people simply melted away. The Spaniards were coming with the sign of the cross in front of them. It's a story that's repeated itself throughout history, and dare I say, it's a story that we have in our scripture reading today. Many commentaries on this story that we read today kind of look at the need for obedience to God, look at all that God did for you, and therefore you should obey him. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Well, it's a lovely concept. It's such a lovely concept that it's been cross-stitched and painted in panels and posted on the walls of people's homes for generations. It speaks to solidarity within the home and obedience to a God who is on our side and defends us through the ages and is therefore worthy of our obedience. Okay, that's the covenant of Shechem. That's what that's called. And it's very important in the history of the Judeo-Christian religion. God who fights for us and sees us as special. So we have this very lengthy description of everything that God had done for the Jewish people up to that point. And these stories include family squabbles, betrayals, deliverance, encounters with God, and slaughtering whole other peoples and armies. And now with Joshua, the Jews are being set up in a land flowing with milk and honey that they have, quote, neither tilled nor earned. Can we stop right there and ask if that bothers you just a little bit? It bothers me. We Judeo-Christian experiences are seen as unique. I hear the tone of exceptionalism, we are special, and exclusionism, You are not. You people outside my household do not get the blessings of God. Well, I am always highly suspicious of anybody who thinks they know the mind of God and his intentions, and that includes Joshua. The Jews justified their taking of the lands of the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and all the rest of that list, which was read to us, and they were conquering. At least they knew the names of the people they were conquering, as opposed to the conquistadors. The conquests were justified by declaring that these enemies were worshiping false gods, and the Jews were worshiping the one true God. So we're on the side of the Jews because that's our history. That's our Bible. And I have no reason to doubt this history insofar as it hasn't been disproved or anything. It's these scriptures, though, that are used to justify, here's the current events part of this talk, the Zionist movement today and the existence of Israel to this very day. Jews, of course, are not the only ones who have practiced exceptionalism or justified conquest of other peoples as their God-given right, just as in our Argentinian example. But in Joshua's days, the Jews were promised a land flowing with milk and honey, and they were told to expect a prosperity they had never known as their birthright. They were literally unsettling to the people who were already there and who were being displaced and massacred. It happened then, and dare I say, it's still happening today. There are a couple of UCC ministers in the Southwest Conference who about every other year lead a group to Israel-Palestine. I went on this trip last year. You are all welcome to go on it. It is a lot of fun. It's very interesting. You learn a lot about this history. You go to what I call the theme park sites. You know, this is where Jesus was supposedly baptized and so on. You go to all those sites. But you also learn a lot about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And boy, do I have a different understanding of that now. I hasten to add, I never felt unsafe. So if any of you are interested in going on that tour, you stay in kind of nice but not extravagant places. You eat well but not extravagantly, and it is very interesting and actually a lot of fun. You can get that information if you're interested in such a trip. But in preparation for that trip, I read a book called From Beirut to Jerusalem by Thomas Friedman. And Friedman is a New York Times journalist, and he's Jewish. And he wrote his history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And he identified several different strands of this exceptionalism and exclusivism that I mentioned. One is messianic. The people of God see themselves as a light to the world. They come back to their land, renewing their life as a Jewish people, an independent nation, and living according to the values of the Torah and the law. The goal is spiritual and moral perfection, and to be what they are ordained to be, a moral example that will show the way to perfection for the whole world, thus becoming a people worthy of the next Messiah, preparation. The household they talk about in this context is the people who live a life of goodness and law in every aspect of their daily life in order to reach this certain stage of completion. Now, I want to ask you, as Christians, do we define ourselves the same way? Flawed, but perfectible, on the right path, even if we don't always get it right? Do we see our nation and our faith, our household, if you will, as a light to the world? Second, the ultra-Orthodox Jews of Israel are less interested in the land and the nation than in the Talmud and the law as it was practiced while they were in exile. And these are the folks who have the fur hats and the long coats and the side curls. To them, Judaism does not hinge on the state or Israel's boundaries. In fact, many are apolitical and do not serve in the army. Their priority is the traditions, the ritual, the law. Again, I'm led to contemplate our identity as UCC Christians as historical. And does it have to do with how we embrace our practices and our traditions? Is our sense of household based on our forebears, how our grandparents practiced their religions, perhaps the Plymouth Rock Puritans or our German grandparents who immigrated here with all their attachments to ways of celebrating holidays and eating certain foods. If we didn't have those, would we lose our identity? Another definition of household is the secular Zionists, and these folks in Israel see it as geographic. This is literally the boundaries that they are defining and are willing to defend. Things like the Torah and the commandments are not so important to these folks because those were things that just held them together while you were in exile. But now that they're back there, they're defining the land, and these are the folks that go into the army and fight to the death. We are Jews because we have a nation, is the language that they would use. But again, wouldn't you be rather desperate if your UCC congregation were picked up and sent to a large another country? Wouldn't you be rather wanting to get together and eat pasties or sing the songs in your native language and so on? You'd want to maintain your identity. But once you get away from that sense of urgency, you come back, maybe you don't need a pasty that month, right? So our first thought when we say house or household or home is our family. 21 South Cedar, that's the street address where I grew up. Well, does that hold up? Not at all, because everybody who lived there is scattered to New Orleans, Tucson, Idaho, Ottawa, Chicago. They're all over the place, but they are still my household. So there needs to be some other definition besides place that defines household, and it has to do with faith and values. The example of a household having the same boundaries as the 50 states is something that is kind of rejected. State and religion are separated in our Constitution, and it's something that we do well to remember. The more progressive and tolerant Jews of Israel believed that the Jews were Jews in Egypt before they were Jews at Sinai. And what I mean by this is that their identity, the Passover, preceded the commandments. In other words, the holiness of the people precedes the holiness of the land or even the law. And here is a definition of household that I can get behind. In this scenario, our household is pluralistic, a sacred group of people who are bonded by family and respect, which is able to encompass various liturgies, practices, backgrounds, ethnicities, and is not tied to a geographical location so much as a sense of sacred interconnectedness. Our household emphatically cannot be equated with country. One thing, however, that seems clear to me, that our sense of family or household, if you wish, is at the DNA level. Sometimes it doesn't even feel rational. We all identify with groups. It's how we survive. It's how we feel when our group is threatened. We react. I like some of my Canadian friends very well, but I get pretty grumpy with them when they start criticizing my country. That's my job. I don't want to hear it from them. And it's just visceral. That's how I react. So I want to suggest that the group that you feel that way about is your household. And to take further, for there to be peace in this world, yes, one must take the stand that God is good and worthy to be obeyed, as Joshua says. Perhaps we should humbly evaluate and enlarge the notion of household and invite as many people into it as possible. I admit to being heartened by some of the news stories over the last few weeks of volunteers at the borders and train stations greeting the Syrian refugees with food and clothing, some even inviting folks home for dinner. Invite the stranger, welcome the guest, invite the immigrant, even if they have a different set of practices, even if they come to us with a whole other history, and especially if they are in need. If you react viscerally in their defense when they are under attack, you will know that your household has enlarged, the gospel has been embodied. Swing open that door. Egypt precedes Sinai. Passover precedes the law. As for me and my household, we will worship God. And welcome to my living room. Amen.